Hello, and thank you for tuning in to The Christian Skeptic. I'm your host, Sean Kerwin, and as always, it's my mission to take an honest look at our questions about Christianity through the lens of logic and reason. I'm not here to preach at you, just to start a conversation with you. I hope you enjoy the show. So where does morality come from? It's a question that humans have been asking for centuries, really. And I hope to resolve this question in 20 minutes. Just kidding. I want to start the conversation here, and this might be like a part one, part two kind of episode, because I think there are really two main veins of thought that we should probably address here in the little time that we have, and really think through both of their implications and give them both kind of equal chance in the dock, as it were. Equal chance to stand before us and defend themselves. And I think the first main vein of thought is what we'll be discussing today, which is that morality is created by humans and has evolved with us over time. And the second main vein of thought is that morality was given to us at some point by God or the gods or some divine, external to our human experience source. And so we'll get to that one on the next episode. But for today, let's talk about morality as a concept that we create ourselves. And this is not a new idea. I think for me in my experience, and ironically enough, recently in conversations that I've had, one of the most prominent arguments for this comes from Friedrich Nietzsche. As many of you know, I'm a huge fan of Nietzsche. I've mentioned him many times on the show, and I love his writings. I don't always agree with them, but I love to encounter them as a means of challenging my thoughts and my perspectives on things. So let's start with kind of what he thinks on morality. And he's not alone in this. The other German philosopher, Hegel, shares a similar kind of vein of thought on this. And this thought runs all the way up through history, from the Frankfurt School in Germany, and then to the Western culture that we now have today. And basically, it's the thought that as humans evolved and encountered one another, so also evolved the laws and the rules of how humans should interact. What we say we ought and ought not to do is basically based off of a series of experiments of human interactions of what worked and did not work. And so when something worked, it became an ought, a should. You should treat people how you want to be treated, because there's a measuring that humans do with each other. And when something doesn't work, there's a should not. To quote Friedrich Nietzsche from The Genealogy of Morality, he says, "The feeling of guilt, of personal obligation to pursue our train of inquiry again originated, as we saw, in the oldest and most primitive personal relationship there is, in the relationship of buyer and seller, creditor and debtor. Here, person met person for the first time, and measured himself, person, against person. No form of civilization has been discovered which is so low that it does not display something of this relationship. Everything has its price. Everything can be compensated for. This is the oldest, most naive canon of morals relating to justice, the beginning of all good-naturedness, equity, and goodwill, all objectivity on earth. Justice, at this first level, is the goodwill between those who are roughly equal, to come to terms with each other, to come to an understanding, again, by means of a settlement, and, in connection with those who are less powerful, to force them to reach a settlement amongst themselves." And I think that basically sums up the overall gist of this proposition that morality evolves with us as humans. And so, let's talk about where this holds weight. There's a sense in which we're marching into territory that is both correct, but I don't know that we want to base our theology off of one of them. And I want to see if that's what we can discover in this episode and the next one. And what I mean by saying it's correct is it's a correct observation of how the world sometimes works. And I think both observations of morality are correct in that regard, that morals evolve with us, And we might be dancing a fine line between morals and ethics here. And so it might even be better said that ethics evolve with us. But at the same time, it can be observed that there is a natural law that seems to also govern the world. And what we're dealing with here is just natural and positive law theory. But more on that in the next episode, because in this episode, I want to talk about the idea that all law is positive law at its root. And it's only those laws that have preserved the species for thousands of years that have turned into natural law. But we have internet ethics currently that they did not have 2,000 years ago. There's things you should and shouldn't say and do on the internet that, well, didn't really exist before the internet. So to say that ethics and morals don't evolve with us is incorrect. So there's some element of correctness and correct thinking here with the idea that morals and ethics evolve as we do. Traffic lights were not a thing in ancient Rome. Speeding tickets were not a thing in ancient Rome. There's an evolution of right and wrong as we progress as a species. But what is that evolution based off of? So to take the argument that Nietzsche and others present would be to say that the basis of that evolution is the continuation and propagation of the human species, and that we're biologically programmed for survival. So if we took a moral such as the moral of honesty, which says that lying is wrong and dealing honestly with people is good, we can probably trace that back to some evolutionary byproduct as a means of survival, that when you're in your tribe, if you lie to the members of your tribe to gain power or to protect yourself, you could end up hurting others in the tribe more than just yourself. And therefore, the others that could be hurt could overpower you and you would die. So your biology, thousands and thousands of years ago, started wiring you to feel good about honesty and feel bad about lying. And overall, it worked out pretty good for the human race, that as humans were honest, those tribes tended to succeed and prevail against tribes with dishonesty and disjointedness, that the tribes that had more dishonest members ended up being weaker because there was a lack of trust. And we know that this principle still holds true even today, where we don't have necessarily tribes in the jungle warring against each other, but we do know that in business, when you study your average business owner, your average person with a $1 to $10 million net worth, they say that the thing that helps them get ahead the most in business is dealing honestly with people. And that makes sense, right? Because, you take your car to the local oil change place and you want to get an oil change, you do business with that person, assuming that they're honest with you, because you don't know everything going on with your car. So there's an element of trust in which you spend your money. But if that person's lying to you and it's found out that they're lying to you, you never take your car to them again. And that business, if they lie to enough people, will eventually die out. And that's the same concept that existed back in the tribes. And so there we see a moral and an ethical code that helped survival back in the day that has continued on with us to this day. And worse so, Nietzsche takes it even a step further in his genealogy of morality to talk about how religion is sometimes the power play or the pleasure play to assert the moral and ethical code of the weak upon the strong. That this idea of humility and repentance and chastity coming from the religious moral code is in some way a power play for those without strength, for those without knowledge, for those without ability to assert control over those that have it. And that because the exceptionally strong, the exceptionally smart, the exceptionally talented are more rare than the average person wants the power. There's a motive there. There's a tribal warring that therefore helps the religious moral code establish power over the entire world. And of course, Nietzsche is, in the late 1800s, he's very anti-Semitic, and he does reduce the Jews to a parasite in his book Beyond Good and Evil. And Adolf Hitler does take some of his writing and twist it even further when he writes the book Mein Kampf. But the logic isn't that bad. It's pretty bad, and it's not correct. But you can see where he's coming from. This deducing that if morals and ethics are exactly what we feel in that time, and what we feel we can trust because our biology has programmed us for survival of not only ourselves, but our tribe and our reproduction, right? Because biology also places a huge emphasis on reproduction and sustained life of the offspring, then we should be able to rationalize and reason and deduce further evolutions in morality, even evolutions in morality now that might make others feel bad. And that's the part of this argument that's hard to get past. That's the part of this argument that if morality really is based on what we feel and our attitudes towards a thing at a given time, to change morality contrary to feelings and attitudes is almost self-contradictory, is dangerously self-contradictory, I might add. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Abolition of Man, adds, and I quote, "The belief that certain attitudes are really true and others are really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are, and because our approvals and disapprovals are thus recognitions of objective value or responses to objective order, therefore, emotional states can be in harmony with reason." In other words, when we feel liking for what we ought to be approved, or harmony with reason, when we perceive that that liking is due but cannot feel it, no emotion is a judgment. In that sense, all emotions and sentiments are illogical, but they can be reasonable or unreasonable as they conform to reason or fail to conform. The heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. And so what Lewis is saying here is that there's a dangerous line to be crossed, that feelings and logic do not always line up, and we know that to be true. Like, we're in the modern age. We know that, especially in our culture, we are more hyper-attuned and hypersensitive to anxiety. And I don't want to downplay it. You know, if you struggle with anxiety, that's a very real thing. But we know that anxiety is our body working like it should, right? Like any good psychologist will tell you that. But just because your body works like it should doesn't mean it's always correct in how it applies that working. For example, if you struggle with anxiety, anxiety is just your body giving off alarm bells and signals saying that there's danger ahead. And a struggle with anxiety means that you're saying there's danger when there's not really danger. And there are ways to work through that. And if you struggle with it, I really encourage you. A good counselor can help you work through anxiety and overcome its improper application and help your body to properly identify those things that should give you anxiety and properly identify those things that shouldn't give you anxiety. But what Lewis is saying here is that if our feelings only dictate what is moral and not moral, in other words, if I trust my biology and say that what I approve of is good and what I disapprove of is bad, then there's a very good chance that I'll be wrong at some point. And hopefully I'm not wrong in a major way. And if we take Nietzsche and Hitler's idea that the Jewish people are a parasite on the world, well, we've seen it can make a country very, very wrong in a horrible way. But if all morality is evolving with us and there is no higher power giving us this morality, then you can't actually say Nazi Germany was evil. And that's the twisted part, is that an entire people group agreed on a moral, ethical code, and they acted on it. And all we can say is that we won the war, is that those that did not like the Nazi regime won the war, and that's why it was wrong, because we had the power and we came out on top. There was no other reason why it was wrong other than we won the war and it displeased us that the Nazi regime was executing Jews in concentration camps to the tune of millions, that some of the worst crimes against humanity, which is what they were charged for in the Nuremberg trials, were committed on people through brutal experiments and horrible things and horrible treatment. You can't actually say that was evil. All you can say is it displeased you and that you're a part of the majority people group that won the war that it also displeased, and therefore we are now saying that this is a part of our moral ethical code as the world, but until someone with more power comes along who disagrees, and maybe you're the one in the concentration camp next, then you can't say it's wrong. And if everyone in the world thinks it's okay, then there's no basis to stand up for it. And that, I think, is the biggest flaw in all of this. Add to the fact that this only deals with half of the argument. This only deals with what happens when this idea that the moral ethical code evolves with us as humans goes wrong. What about when it goes right. So when it goes wrong, whatever displeases you, whatever you say is evil, you have no basis to stand on and actually say that it's evil. All you can say is it displeases you. And so I think that's the flaw when it comes to what's wrong or what one ought not to do in the evolved moral code of humanity. But the evolution of the moral code in humanity is just a means to an end. And so you have to ask, what is the end? And that's with anything in evolution, right? If we take a neo-Darwinian approach to evolution and we ask, what's the end to the means of evolution? Well, there isn't really an answer. I mean, there's kind of an answer, right? Because the end is some sort of random chaosness. And the end is just survival and power in the neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, which is also what Friedrich Nietzsche gets at in his work on Beyond Good and Evil, that the end is this Übermensch, right? That ultimately uses all power, pleasure to develop a will to truth in the end and becomes the next evolutionary step in humanity. And if we take a theistic evolution approach, the end is human intelligence. That if under the theistic evolutionary approach, and we've done an episode on this before, so go back and check that out if you want the whole summation of it all. But the end is intellect. The end is wisdom and intelligence. Heck, even if we take the creationist approach without evolution at all, right? The end is man made in God's image. The end is someone given reason, volition, intelligence, and wisdom. So what's the end for the moral ethical code? Well, in the next episode, I want to talk about if there's a natural moral law given to us by God, in which case the end is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, but more on that next time. The end of the moral evolutionary code is the same as the end in neo-Darwinian evolution. The end is power, and the end is pleasure. Think about it. If all morals and ethics are based on biological programming, are based on the transaction, the business deal, as Friedrich Nietzsche says, that interactions between humans would go so well as to increase our dopamine levels at the end of them, then what this means is if you follow a moral ethical code, you will feel good at the end of the day. You will have an increased dopamine rush to your brain and your heart. And you want to keep doing that. But in order to keep doing that, you need to be the one making the rules, or at least your tribe or the people group you associate with. Therefore, you follow morals and ethics so that you feel good about yourself, but you also impose morals and ethics as a means of power so that others follow your moral ethical code or the moral ethical code you agree with, and you continue to feel good about yourself because you have the power to make it so. You have the power to make your will done on earth. So, the ultimate good in an evolved moral theory is power. And, that's correct. And follow me on this train of thought here, right? Because we live in a society that is probably equally shaped now by a naturally given moral ethical code as it is shaped by an evolved moral ethical code. I have many conversations with people in very casual settings where they say, well, morality is just something we've created over, thousands and millions of years, equally as much as people say that morality is given to us. And this isn't anything new. I think this goes back to the Babylonian creation myth versus the creation myth of Genesis, right? Either we kill a god and construct society out of their remains, which is also Nietzsche's God is dead metaphor, or society is given to us by a very alive and relational God, and we must build upon the progress of the ancestors of our past. I think those two ideas are still warring today just as much as they were 8, 9, 10,000 years ago. Like there's nothing new under the sun, to quote Ecclesiastes. And therefore, given all of that, if morality evolves with us, if we've killed God and we're constructing society out of his or her remains, then we are the ones in charge of our moral ethical code. And so if it's evolving with us, peak morality is not love like it is in a moral ethical code given to us by revelation. Peak power and pleasure is the ultimate good in an evolved moral ethical code. It's exactly what Nietzsche said. Justice is nothing but a business transaction. And a business transaction is something that you hope to benefit from. No one starts a business hoping to break even. You start a business hoping to make money, hoping to hire employees, hoping to have control over your own little kingdom, as it were. And I don't hate anyone that starts a business. I mean, I think if you start a business, more power to you. That's something fantastic and noble to do. But of course, I say that believing in what we're going to talk about next time with a moral code that is revealed to us. But without that, actually starting a business is pretty horrible. It's just a power and pleasure play, just like everything else in the world. If your morality is evolved by your biology, we know your biology hungers to stay alive, to reproduce, have as many offspring as you can, and have those offspring be as successful and ideally more successful than you are. So therefore, the end of human morality, using the means of evolving with humans, is power, is pleasure. And maybe that's why we hate politicians so much. Maybe that's why humans revolt against authority so much, is because deep down inside of us, they got what we wanted all along. They have the highest power and pleasure that we wanted and can't have. At least can't have by means of the current system. So let's overthrow. Let's riot, right? Like, let's protest. Let's storm capitals and fight. And if you think this is starting to sound like a communist manifesto at this point, it probably is, because that's the end of the moral ethics. That the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are the opposing classes in the moral dilemma and the moral playing field. And the bourgeoisie are the ones with all the ends of the moral ethical game. They have the power, they have the pleasure, they have the riches. And that's the end-all be-all of all moral ethical striving. The only reason to be good is to get ahead in life. The only reason to treat anyone nicely is so that you will feel better about your social, economical, or political standing at the end of the day. If this is true, which again, to some degree it is, right? Because some people live like this. Some nations have operated like this. So there's a sense in which it is correct, at least as an observation. But if it's correct as a prescription for the way you should live your life moving forward, it's a very dark place to be. And I know we're out of time, so we have to end this episode on a dark note. But I will say, there's a contradiction here. Because when you follow out the means and the end of an evolved moral ethical code, it goes against your biological programming, because you realize that if everyone treated each other like this, if everyone used each other like this, that would feel bad. That would feel bad, which is the basis for this evolved moral ethical code in the beginning, right? Like, what feels bad is wrong. And I can't prove it's wrong, but I do submit to you that this is a very strong piece of evidence that the current moral ethical code that we as humans generally operate by has been evolved with us over thousands and thousands of years. I think this is evidence against that theory. That if you carry it out to its most extreme end conclusions, it basically swallows itself whole in its own contradiction. But as always, send me your thoughts. Write in, comment, leave a like, a review. Let me know what you think. And between now and the next episode, let me know what you think about a moral ethical code being revealed to humans versus defined by humans. Because I can't wait to have that discussion with you too. So as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the show.